2 in the morning, the North Arabian Sea. USS Abraham Lincoln pivoted 30 degrees into the wind, her 4 massive bronze shafts pushing 100,000 tons of steel toward a precise launch heading. This was not a freedom of navigation exercise or a routine presence patrol. Somewhere 300 miles to the north, buried deep beneath the jagged coastal mountains of Iran, a set of reinforced concrete bunkers held the long-range missile capability to set the entire region on fire. The question hanging over the deck was not if the strike would succeed, but whether the air wing could return before the horizon erupted in a retaliatory swarm. The air above the flight deck was a thick, humid cocktail of salt spray and the acrid chemical stench of JP-5 jet fuel. Across the 4-acre expanse of the flight deck, the scene was one of choreographed lethality. Under the eerie, low-visibility blue floodlights, hundreds of sailors in color-coded jerseys moved with the practiced efficiency of a single organism. The red shirts, the aviation ordnancemen, were finishing the final inspections on the heavy ordnance hanging from the pylons of the FA-18 Super Hornets. Each aircraft carried a lethal loadout of GBU-31 Joint Direct Attack munitions, 2,000-pound bunker busters designed to punch through meters of reinforced concrete before detonating. Beside them, the yellow shirts, the aircraft directors, used glowing wands to guide the multi-million-dollar machines toward the 4 steam-powered catapults that would soon hurl them into the black abyss of the night sky. Inside the ready rooms, the atmosphere was a stark contrast to the roar of the deck. The pilots of Carrier Air Wing 7 sat in high-backed chairs, their flight suits zipped tight, G-suits adjusted, and helmets resting on their laps. The mission commander, a veteran commander with over 3,000 flight hours, stood before a digital map of the Iranian coastline. He spoke in the measured, professional tones of the United States Navy, devoid of bravado, but heavy with the weight of the coming operation. The target was the Tabas 3 long-range missile complex, a facility that intelligence confirmed was being prepared for a massive saturation strike against regional allies. The orders were absolute: total destruction of the primary storage bays. The transition from the silence of the ready room to the cockpit of a fighter jet was a ritual of focus. Climbing the boarding ladder of an FA-18 fighter, each pilot became an extension of the machine. The canopy slid forward with a mechanical whine, sealing out the humid night and replacing it with the hum of electronics and the smell of recycled oxygen. One by one, the twin General Electric 4x4 engines began their high-pitched scream, a sound that vibrated through the steel of the deck and into the soles of every sailor's boots. The heat shimmering off the jet pipes distorted the moonlight, creating a hazy, flickering ghost of the strike group's silhouette. The catapult lit up. At exactly 2:15 in the morning, the first aircraft, a VAW-125 E-2 Delta Advanced Hawkeye, was taxied onto catapult number 1. This massive propeller-driven aircraft, with its distinctive rotating radar dome, would serve as the quarterback of the entire strike, coordinating the movements of dozens of jets and monitoring the Iranian air defense network for any sign of activity. The shooter on the deck, dressed in a yellow jersey and goggles, knelt and touched the deck, his hand sweeping forward in the universal signal for launch. The catapult fired with a violent, chest-compressing thud. The Hawkeye was accelerated from 0 to 160 miles per hour in just under 3 seconds, disappearing over the bow and into the darkness. Moments later, catapults 2 and 3 fired in rapid succession, launching the EA-18 Golf Growlers. These electronic warfare variants were the invisible shield of the package, equipped with high-powered jamming pods designed to blind the HQ-9 surface-to-air missile batteries that guarded the Iranian coast. As the Growlers climbed toward 20,000 feet, the main strike force began to move. 12 FA-18 Super Hornets, divided into 3 divisions of 4, taxied toward the catapults. Each pilot performed a final flight control check, the rudders and flaps dancing in the dim light. They were heavy with fuel and heavy with steel, their engines glowing a deep, angry orange as they moved into the afterburner stage. The deck shuddered under the combined force of 48,000 pounds of thrust. The launch of the strike force was a relentless drumbeat of power. Every 45 seconds, another jet was flung into the night, the white steam from the catapults rising like ghosts from the deck before being whipped away by the wind. By 2:45 in the morning, the flight deck was suddenly, jarringly quiet. Only the low hum of the ship's radar and the distant white noise of the wake remained. High above, out of sight, and running silent, the most sophisticated strike package in the world was forming up, turning their noses toward the north and the high-stakes confrontation that awaited them over the Iranian mountains. 2:35 in the morning. Deep within the steel labyrinth of the USS Abraham Lincoln, the Carrier Intelligence Center was a tomb of silent, high-stakes analysis. While the strike package climbed into the thin air of the upper atmosphere, a team of 30 intelligence officers and imagery analysts monitored a live feed of the Iranian coastline. The room smelled of ozone from the massive server banks and the faint, bitter scent of over-roasted coffee. On the primary tactical display, a series of high-resolution satellite images showed the Tabas 3 missile complex, a sprawling industrial scar carved into the limestone base of the Zagros Mountains. This was not merely a storage site. It was a hardened fortress designed to withstand a nuclear near-miss. The facility was located at coordinates 27 degrees 15 minutes north, 56 degrees 18 minutes east, less than 40 miles from the strategic choke point of the Strait of Hormuz. Intelligence gathered by Global Hawk high-altitude unmanned aircraft over the last 72 hours indicated a massive increase in activity. Heat signatures detected by infrared sensors showed that the massive steel blast doors, each weighing over 40 tons, had been opened for the first time in 6 months. The United States Navy analysts had identified at least 12 Segil 2 medium-range ballistic missiles being moved from the deep assembly galleries to the forward fueling bays. The strategic necessity of the strike was clear and documented in a 300-page briefing delivered to Indo-Pacific Command just 6 hours prior. The Segil 2 is a solid-fueled missile with a range of over 2,000 kilometers, capable of reaching every major United States base in the Middle East and several key European capitals. Unlike older liquid-fueled designs, these missiles could be prepared for launch in under 15 minutes. If the Tabas 3 facility was allowed to complete its current fueling cycle, the Iranian military would possess the capability to launch a saturation strike that could overwhelm any existing missile defense architecture in the region. The target itself was divided into 3 primary zones, designated by the strike planners as Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie. Zone Alpha consisted of the 3 main tunnel entrances, reinforced with 5 meters of high-strength, steel mesh reinforced concrete. These were the only points of ingress for the heavy transport vehicles, and the primary ventilation shafts for the entire underground complex. Zone Bravo was the liquid oxygen and solid fuel storage annex, a series of smaller, unhardened buildings located 500 meters to the west of the main mountain face. Zone Charlie was the command and control bunker, buried 400 feet beneath the peak of the mountain, connected to the surface by a forest of encrypted communications antennas. Inside the intelligence center, the analysts moved with clinical precision, updated target coordinates being transmitted via encrypted data link, directly to the mission computers of the FA-18 fighters now crossing the coastline. Each pilot saw the 3-dimensional wireframe model of the mountain. On their head-up display, the internal structure of the facility illuminated in a digital red glow. The mission's success hinged on the ability of the strike force to hit the ventilation shafts at a precise angle of 45 degrees, allowing the 2,000-pound bunker buster bombs to penetrate deep into the mountain before the secondary fuses detonated. The atmosphere in the room was one of professional detachment, masking the reality that the order to destroy the facility was a move of last resort. The United States had attempted to resolve the tension through 3 weeks of back-channel diplomacy and naval signaling, but the movement of the missiles into the launch bays was a crossing of the red line. The tactical officers watched as the blue icons representing the American aircraft crossed the fence, the invisible line marking the edge of Iranian territorial waters. The radar screens showed the coastal defense batteries beginning to pulse with energy. As the Iranian operators woke to the threat, the mountains of the Iranian coast were visible on the long-range infrared cameras. of the EA-18 Golf Growlers. The peaks were jagged, black silhouettes against a sky that was starting to haze with high-altitude ice crystals. The air at 30,000 feet was a brutal 60 degrees below zero. A silent, frozen vacuum that carried no sound of the approaching storm. But inside the mountain, the heat of the missile engines and the activity of 2,000 Iranian personnel created a massive thermal signature that glowed like a beacon on the American screens. The target was locked, the profiles were confirmed, and the window for a peaceful resolution had slammed shut. 2:55 in the morning. At an altitude of 28,000 feet, the strike package from Carrier Air Wing 7 had formed into a tight, lethal geometry of aluminum and titanium. The night sky over the North Arabian Sea was an endless, velvet void, broken only by the dim, green luminescence of cockpit multifunction displays, and the faint, ghostly shimmer of the stars reflecting off the plexiglass canopies. To an outside observer, the formation would be invisible, but on the tactical data links of the United States Navy, it was a complex network of 32 distinct icons moving in perfect synchronization at 450 knots. The heart of the strike consisted of 12 FA-18 Super Hornet fighters, drawn from the VFA-103 Jolly Rogers and the VFA-86 Sidewinders. These aircraft were the primary strikers, each one a dual-engine powerhouse capable of delivering precision ordnance under any weather conditions. The pilots were encased in a pressurized environment that smelled of dry, recycled oxygen and the faint, metallic scent of the electronics cooling fans. Every movement was recorded. Every sensor sweep was analyzed by the onboard computers of the AN/APG-79 active electronically scanned array radar, which was currently searching the dark horizon for any sign of Iranian interceptors rising from the inland airbases. Protecting the strikers were 4 EA-18 Golf Growler electronic warfare aircraft. These specialized jets, recognizable by the large, blade-like antennas on their wingtips and the AN/ALQ-99 jamming pods hanging from their bellies, were the invisible wall of the formation. Their mission was to drown out the Iranian early warning network with a flood of electromagnetic noise, turning the enemy's radar screens into a useless blizzard of static. The electronic warfare officers in the back seats of the Growlers worked with intense focus, their fingers dancing across touchscreens as they identified and categorized every pulse of radar energy emanating from the Iranian coastline. They were looking for the specific fingerprint of the HQ-9 surface-to-air missile systems, a high-priority threat that had to be neutralized before the bombers reached their release point. Orchestrating the entire operation from 50 miles behind the main force was the E-2 Delta Advanced Hawkeye. Inside the cramped, windowless fuselage of the radar plane, 3 mission controllers sat before large circular displays, managing the air picture for the entire strike. They were the all-seeing eye, using their massive AN/APY-9 radar to track hundreds of targets simultaneously, from the friendly tankers waiting in the refueling orbit to the small, fast-moving Iranian patrol boats far below on the surface of the water. The air inside the Hawkeye was cold and hummed with the vibration of the 2 massive turboprop engines as they issued a steady stream of tactical updates via encrypted voice radio. For the pilots of the Super Hornets, the flight was a study in sensory deprivation and intense concentration. The only sound was the steady, rhythmic hiss of the oxygen regulator and the low-frequency rumble of the 2 General Electric 4x4 engines pushing them through the thin air. Below them, the sea was a black carpet, occasionally broken by the tiny, pinprick lights of a merchant vessel or a fishing dhow. Ahead, the Iranian coastline began to take shape on their infrared sensors, a jagged line of mountains that looked like a wall of cold, gray stone rising out of the darkness. The strike package carried a diverse and devastating array of ordnance. In addition to the 2,000-pound bunker busters intended for the missile complex, the aircraft were armed with AIM-120 advanced medium-range air-to-air missiles and AIM-9X sidewinders for self-defense. If an Iranian 4 Phantom or MiG-29 attempted to interfere, the Super Hornets were prepared to clear the skies in seconds. Each pilot had practiced this mission dozens of times in high-fidelity simulators. But the cold reality of the Iranian coast looming ahead brought a sharp, metallic taste of adrenaline to their mouths. 3 in the morning. The formation reached the initial point, a pre-designated set of coordinates where the package would split into its 3 separate attack groups. The Growlers moved to their high-altitude orbits to begin the primary jamming sequence, while the Super Hornets began a rapid, nose-down descent toward the terrain. They were dropping into the clutter, using the shadows of the mountains to hide from the enemy's long-range eyes. The temperature in the cockpits rose slightly as they entered the thicker air near the surface, and the vibration increased as the aircraft fought the turbulent winds whipping off the coastal cliffs. The hunt had begun, and the sword of the Republic was about to strike. 3:15 in the morning. The leading edge of the strike package, a division of 4 FA-18 Super Hornets, crossed the Iranian coastline at a point 12 miles west of the port city of Bandar Abbas. As the aircraft transitioned from the open water to the rugged terrain of the mainland, the pilots performed the fence check, a rapid series of cockpit actions that shifted the jets from a transit posture to a combat-ready state. With a flick of several switches, the master arm was moved. To the on position, all external lights were extinguished, and the electronic identification systems were set to silent. The cockpit, already dark, was now illuminated only by the faint, ghostly green glow of the night vision goggles strapped to the pilots' helmets. The flight lead, a lieutenant commander with the call sign Viper, pushed his control stick forward, initiating a steep, high-speed descent from 20,000 feet. The 4 aircraft followed in a loose finger 4 formation, their airframes shuddering as they entered the thicker, warmer air of the lower altitudes. The transition was a physical weight, a steady increase in G-force that pressed the pilots back into their Martin Baker ejection seats. The air inside the cockpits, which had been freezing at high altitude, now smelled of ozone and the faint, salty tang of the pilot's own sweat, as the environmental control system struggled to adjust to the rapid change in pressure. Dropping to a mere 200 feet above the desert floor, the Super Hornets utilized terrain masking to hide from the Iranian HQ-9 surface-to-air missile batteries. They flew through the deep, winding canyons of the coastal range, their wings occasionally banked at 60 degrees to clear the jagged limestone ridges that rose like shark teeth out of the darkness. The AN/APG-79 radar was now operating in a low probability of intercept mode, scanning the terrain ahead and feeding a 3-dimensional map of the obstacles directly into the pilot's heads-up displays. It was a high-speed game of shadows, where a single mechanical error or a moment of lost concentration would result in a high-speed collision with the mountain wall. 10 miles behind the strikers, the EA-18 Golf Growlers began their work in earnest. The electronic warfare officers in the rear seats monitored their screens with predatory intensity, watching as the Iranian early warning radars began to sweep the area. When a radar beam from an Iranian FAT-40 long-range surveillance system passed over the formation, the Growlers responded instantly. They projected a series of digital ghosts, false targets, that appeared on the enemy screens as a chaotic swarm of hundreds of aircraft moving in every direction at once. The Iranian operators, confused by the sudden electronic blizzard, were forced to reset their systems, providing the American strike group with a critical 30-second window of invisibility. The environment around the aircraft was a study in monochromatic tension. Through the night vision goggles, the Iranian landscape was a surreal, lime-green world of stark shadows and brilliant highlights. The heat rising from the desert floor created shimmering waves of distortion that made the horizon look like it was underwater. The only sound in the pilots' ears was the constant, rhythmic, heavy breathing through their oxygen masks and the occasional, staccato burst of secure voice radio traffic from the E-2 Delta Hawkeye orbiting far out to sea. Every pilot was acutely aware that they were now deep inside hostile territory, moving through the very heart of one of the most densely defended airspaces in the world. As the strike group approached the push point, 20 miles south of the Tabbas 3 missile complex, the wind began to pick up, whistling over the canopies and creating a light turbulence that rattled the heavy GBU-31 bunker busters hanging from the wing pylons. The pilots tightened their grip on the throttles, their eyes scanning the dark horizon for the telltale flash of a missile launch. They were now inside the kill envelope. of the short-range Iranian air defenses, where shoulder-fired missiles and anti-aircraft guns could erupt at any moment. The mission had now reached its most vulnerable phase. The Super Hornets had to climb slightly to acquire their targets, a move that would momentarily expose them to the enemy's tracking radars. The tactical plan called for a synchronized pop-up maneuver. Where all 12 aircraft would rise, release their ordnance, and dive back into the safety of the canyons in less than 20 seconds. The timing had to be perfect. On the tactical data link, a countdown timer began to pulse in red. 60 seconds to weapon release. The silence of the night was about to be shattered by the sound of 48,000 pounds of high explosives meeting reinforced concrete. 3:20 in the morning. The digital piece of the cockpit was shattered by a high-pitched, warbling tone in the pilot's headsets. The AAA warning of an enemy radar lock. On the threat displays of the FA-18 Super Hornets, a yellow diamond appeared, quickly turning a solid, angry red. An Iranian HQ-9 surface-to-air missile system, located on a ridge 5 miles north of the target complex, had finally pierced the electronic veil of the Growlers and was now painting the lead division with a high-energy tracking beam. The air, which had been silent and still, was now charged with the invisible energy of a looming catastrophe. The suppression of enemy air defenses, or SEAD, was a mission of calculated aggression. The 4 EA-18 Gulf Growlers, orbiting at 25,000 feet, reacted with the speed of a digital reflex. The electronic warfare officers did not wait for the enemy to fire. They coordinated a magnum called the Universal Code for the launch of an anti-radiation missile. The tactical plan called for the total decapitation of the Iranian air defense nodes before the heavy bombers reached their release point. The goal was to leave the Tabbas 3 facility blind and defenseless in the critical seconds before impact. The pilot of the lead Growler toggled the weapon select switch to the AGM-88 harm missile. With a firm press of the red launch button, the trigger was squeezed. The missile shrieked off the rail, a white column of fire punching backward through the smoke. The heat blast washed across the fuselage of the aircraft, momentarily lighting up the dark cockpit with a blinding orange glow that bleached the green hue of the night vision goggles. The sound of the rocket motor was a guttering roar that vibrated through the pilot's seat before the missile accelerated to 3 times the speed of sound, trailing a jagged ribbon of white exhaust against the black sky. The AGM-88 followed the invisible thread of the Iranian radar beam with predatory precision. The warhead punched straight through the center of the HQ-9 radar dish, detonating with a kinetic force that transformed the sophisticated electronics into a cloud of molten copper and glass. The massive 10-meter structure was shredded into thousands of jagged steel fragments that were sent flying across the desert floor, like shrapnel from a giant grenade. The explosion was so intense that it momentarily blinded the thermal sensors of the orbiting Hawkeye, creating a white-hot bloom on the tactical screens. The Iranian defenders reacted with a mix of panic and desperate courage. At the radar site, the operators who had been focused on their screens had only milliseconds to see the loss of signal before their command van erupted in a shower of sparks and flame. 2 nearby support vehicles, carrying spare missile canisters, were crushed by the falling debris of the radar mast. Their fuel tanks ruptured instantly, igniting into a secondary fireball that rose 60 feet into the air, casting long, flickering shadows across the rocky hillside. On the other side of the ridge, a secondary Iranian battery attempted to fire a wild, unguided salvo of 3 missiles into the sky, but the Growlers instantly flooded their frequencies with a wall of white noise, causing the missiles to veer off course and detonate harmlessly in the empty desert. Black smoke rose from the twisted remains of the radar site, a jagged and burning silhouette against the pre-dawn sky. The dead silence that followed on the Iranian tracking frequencies was the most telling result of the strike. On the American tactical displays, the red diamond, representing the HQ-9 threat, flickered once and then vanished, replaced by a clear, blue corridor leading directly to the heart of the Tabas 3 complex. The electronic shield had been shattered, and the path was now open for the heavy hitters of the Jolly Rogers. The mission commander, observing the kill from his cockpit, issued a short, two-word command over the secure link. Target clear. The 12 Super Hornets of the main strike force began their final climb, their noses pitching up toward the cold, thin air at 30,000 feet. They were now less than 90 seconds from the release point. The air in the cockpits was thick with the smell of ozone and the heavy, metallic scent of the pilot's own adrenaline. The suppression mission had done its job. The enemy was blind, and the sword of the Republic was mid-swing. 3:25 in the morning. The 12 FA-18 Super Hornets reached the terminal release point, their nose cameras locked onto the thermal silhouettes of the Tabas 3 missile complex. The air was suddenly alive with the frantic, high-pitched chirping of the aircraft's mission computers as the GPS coordinates for the bunker busters were finalized. Each pilot felt the heavy, rhythmic thrum of the two General Electric 4x4 engines vibrating through their flight boots, a constant reminder of the massive kinetic energy they were about to unleash upon the mountain. The lead pilot, callsign Viper, depressed the weapon release button on the side of his right-hand throttle. The 2,000-pound GBU-31 Joint Direct Attack munition dropped from the centerline station with a heavy, mechanical clunk that caused the entire 7-ton airframe to lurch upward. The guidance fins on the tail of the bomb snapped open with a sharp metallic crack, and the weapon began its supersonic plunge toward the valley floor. One by one, the other 11 aircraft followed suit, releasing a total of 24 heavy munitions that streaked through the night like invisible hammers falling from the heavens. The warhead punched straight through the 5-meter-thick reinforced concrete cap of the primary ventilation shaft, driving deep into the limestone core of the mountain before the delay fuse triggered. A massive, muffled detonation followed, venting a pillar of white fire and pulverized rock 300 feet into the air. The internal pressure wave severed the main power conduits and crushed the heavy steel blast doors from the inside out, sending jagged shards of metal screaming through the assembly galleries, like high-velocity shrapnel. The heat blast from the explosion reached temperatures of 3,000 degrees, instantly incinerating the sophisticated electronics and the heavy hydraulic systems used to move the missiles. Inside the assembly tunnel, the Iranian technical teams were thrown off their feet as the floor buckled and the air was sucked out of the compartment by the instantaneous vacuum of the blast. One technician was sent flying against a heavy missile transport vehicle, the impact crushing his chest before the ceiling collapsed in a rain of white-hot concrete dust and twisted rebar. The secondary fuel lines ruptured, spraying high-pressure liquid oxygen into the inferno, which created a sequence of rolling, blue-white fireballs that chased the surviving personnel down the darkened corridors. Panic erupted as the emergency lighting failed, leaving the defenders to scramble through a maze of choking black smoke and falling debris. A thick, oily plume of chemical smoke began to boil out of the shattered mountain entrance, the smell of burning rubber and high-grade propellant filling the narrow canyon. The mountain itself seemed to groan under the stress of the internal collapse, a low-frequency rumble that could be felt in the cockpits of the aircraft orbiting 5 miles above. Below the release point, the desert floor was illuminated by the flickering orange glow of the burning ventilation shafts, which now acted as giant chimneys for the subterranean fire. The precision strike had achieved total penetration, and the structural integrity of the Zone Alpha storage bay was officially compromised. The second wave of aircraft targeted Zone Bravo, the fuel storage annex located 500 meters to the west. These were unhardened structures, and the impact of the 2,000-pound bombs was even more catastrophic. The buildings were obliterated in a single white flash that bleached the night sky for 10 miles in every direction. The shock wave from the fuel tanks detonating rolled across the desert floor at 1,200 feet per second, flattening the perimeter fences and flipping several armored security vehicles as if they were made of cardboard. The sound of the detonation was a physical blow, a thunderous crack that echoed off the mountain faces for nearly 30 seconds. As the Super Hornets banked hard to the west to begin their egress, the pilots looked back over their shoulders at a landscape transformed. The once dark mountain was now a jagged silhouette of fire and secondary explosions. The mission objective had been met with clinical, devastating efficiency. The primary storage bays were a graveyard of twisted steel and burning chemicals, and the threat of a long-range missile strike was officially neutralized before a single Iranian engine could be ignited. The Sword of the Republic had landed its first and most decisive blow, 3:30 in the morning. The deep structural fires ignited by the initial strike finally reached the primary storage galleries of Zone Alpha, where 12 Sejil 2 medium-range ballistic missiles sat in their hardened cradles. The intense heat, reaching over 2,000 degrees, breached the thin aluminum casings of the solid-fueled rocket motors. The propellant did not merely burn, it underwent a violent, supersonic transition into a high-pressure gas that the reinforced mountain could no longer contain. A series of secondary eruptions began, each one more powerful than the last, as the heavy missiles cooked off in a chain reaction of chemical fury. The first missile ignited with a guttering roar that sounded like 1,000 jet engines screaming in a confined space. The white-hot exhaust, trapped within the tunnel system, acted like a thermal lance that liquefied the remaining steel blast doors and incinerated everything in its path. 2 seconds later, the entire mountain face seemed to inhale, before exhaling a massive, incandescent plume of violet and orange flame that shot 500 feet into the desert night. The shockwave from the solid fuel detonating punched through the limestone roof, sending boulders the size of main battle tanks tumbling down the jagged slopes. The Iranian defenders on the surface, those who had survived the initial bombardment, were caught in a secondary hell of falling debris and searing heat. A battery of Zu-23 anti-aircraft guns, positioned on a nearby knoll, attempted to open fire on the receding American shadows. The tracers climbed into the sky in desperate, arcing lines of red light, but the gunners were soon overwhelmed by the pressure wave of the mountain's collapse. One gun carriage was flipped onto its side. The crew sent flying into the darkness as the very ground beneath them buckled and cracked under the force of the underground explosions. The heat blast from the secondary eruptions was so intense that the infrared sensors on the EA-18 Golf Growlers temporarily whited out, unable to process the massive thermal energy. The chemical bite of the burning propellant, a mix of ammonium perchlorate and aluminum powder, created a dense, toxic fog that drifted south toward the coast, smelling of burnt metal and caustic acid. From 30,000 feet, the pilots of the Super Hornets watched as the once formidable fortress turned into a glowing volcano of wreckage, the internal structural supports failing as the mountain literally hollowed itself out from the inside. The aftermath was a scene of total strategic erasure. On the tactical screens of the USS Abraham Lincoln, the seismic sensors recorded a magnitude 4.2 event centered exactly on the Tabas 3 complex. All 12 long-range missiles were confirmed destroyed, their high-tech guidance systems and heavy warheads now nothing more than molten slag buried under millions of tons of fallen rock. The command and control antennas of Zone Charlie were snapped like toothpicks by the shifting Earth, severing the facility's connection to the outside world forever. The Iranian response was fractured and chaotic. Radio intercepts captured by the E-2 Delta Hawkeye revealed a complete breakdown in the local chain of command, with surviving units reporting heavy casualties and requesting immediate medical evacuation. Initial battle damage assessments estimated that over 200 Iranian personnel had been killed or wounded in the secondary blasts. For the United States Navy, the cost was remarkably low. One FA-18 reported minor damage to its horizontal stabilizer from a piece of high-flying debris, but all aircraft remained mission-capable and ready for the dangerous transit back to the carrier. 3:40 in the morning. The strike package from Carrier Air Wing 7 executed a sharp, high-G descending turn to the southwest, putting the burning wreckage of the Tabas 3 complex at their 6 o'clock position. The 12 FA-18 Super Hornets were now operating in a gate setting, pushing their twin General Electric 4x4 engines to the absolute limit of their non-afterburning power. They were racing against time, and the inevitable arrival of the Iranian Air Force's Quick Reaction Alert interceptors. The cockpit was a sanctuary of cold, pressurized air, and the rhythmic, metallic hiss of the oxygen regulator. A sharp contrast to the furnace-like heat blooming behind them in the jagged limestone mountains. On the tactical displays of the E-2 Delta Advanced Hawkeye, 2 high-speed contacts were detected lifting off from the concrete runways of Bandar Abbas Air Base, located 40 miles to the east. These were identified as 4 Phantom interceptors, aging but still lethal platforms, that had been scrambled in a desperate attempt to catch the American strike force before they reached the safety of international airspace. The Iranian pilots, likely guided by ground-based observers since their primary radar net was still shattered by jamming, were climbing hard to intercept the American push toward the coast. The EA-18 Golf Growlers immediately shifted their electronic focus from the ground to the air. The electronic warfare officers in the back seats manipulated their jamming beams with surgical precision, projecting a wall of electromagnetic interference that flooded the Phantom's radar frequencies with a chaotic snowstorm of false data. For the Iranian pilots, the world ahead of them became a digital vacuum. Their radar screens were useless, and their radio communications were reduced to a high-pitched, piercing squeal. Despite being blinded, the interceptors continued their pursuit, guided by the massive thermal plumes of the retreating Super Hornets. Inside the lead Super Hornet, the pilot, known as Viper, monitored the closing distance on his situational awareness display. The interceptors were 10 miles out, and closing at a combined speed of over 1,000 knots. He issued a calm, professional directive over the encrypted "Have Quick" radio link, authorizing a defensive engagement. 2 of the escorting Super Hornets banked 45 degrees to the left, their noses rising to meet the threat. They were flying at 22,000 feet, the air outside a frigid 55 degrees below zero, while their internal electronics hummed with the heat of combat operations. The lead escort pilot toggled the weapon select switch to the AIM-120 Advanced Medium-Range Air-to-Air Missile. A digital box stabilized over the lead Iranian contact on his head-up display, and the computer confirmed a solid active lock. With a firm, 2-stage trigger pull, he initiated a Fox 3 launch. The missile dropped from the fuselage rail before its solid rocket motor, ignited with a brilliant white flash that momentarily bleached the dark desert floor below. The AIM-120 accelerated instantly to 4 times the speed of sound, its internal radar taking over the hunt as it streaked toward the lead Phantom. The impact was a distant, silent eruption in the night sky. The Iranian 4 was struck directly in the center of its fuselage, the 22-pound blast fragmentation warhead, shredding the airframe into thousands of pieces of twisted aluminum. A ball of orange fire blossomed at 20,000 feet, casting a momentary, flickering light over the mountains before the wreckage began its long, tumbling descent toward the desert. The second Iranian pilot, seeing his wingman disintegrate in a single flash, immediately broke formation and dove toward the deck, abandoning the chase, in a frantic effort to escape the reach of the American missiles. With the immediate air threat neutralized, the strike force tightened its formation and continued its high-speed dash for the coast. They crossed the shoreline at coordinates 26 degrees 40 minutes north, 55 degrees 20 minutes east at precisely 3:55 in the morning. The call of "feet wet" was transmitted over the secure link, signaling to the USS Abraham Lincoln that the air wing had successfully cleared the Iranian mainland and was now over the international waters of the Persian Gulf. The tension in the cockpits did not disappear, but it shifted from the acute fear of a surface-to-air missile launch to the calculated focus required for a night recovery. The environment above the Gulf was a study in monochromatic peace. The sea below was a vast, obsidian mirror, reflecting the faint green glow of the aircraft's navigation lights. The pilots could finally feel the physical toll of the mission. The adrenaline that had sustained them over the target was beginning to fade, replaced by a heavy, bone-deep exhaustion. They still had 200 miles to fly, and the most dangerous part of any carrier pilot's night, the landing was still waiting for them, on the pitching deck of the carrier. They adjusted their oxygen flows and began the long, steady descent toward the Marshall Stack, leaving the burning mountains of Iran behind them in the dark. 4:15 in the morning. The North Arabian Sea. USS Abraham Lincoln was a ghost of steel and light, her massive silhouette carving a white, churning wake through the obsidian water. The carrier had turned back into the wind, maintaining a steady 25 knots to create the necessary wind over deck for the recovery of the strike package. On the flight deck, the blue floodlights had been replaced by the dim red glow of the landing lights, a visual spectrum designed to preserve the night vision of the pilots and the deck crew. The air was cold, tasting of salt and the sharp, metallic tang of the hydraulic fluid leaking from the massive arrestor gear engines located just below the steel plating. The return of the air wing was signaled by the distant, low-frequency rumble of jet engines growing louder against the wind. The E-2 Delta Advanced Hawkeye was the first to enter the pattern, its massive rotating dome visible against the stars as it banked into a wide, left-hand turn. Inside the primary flight control tower, known as Pry-Fly, the air boss watched his monitors with clinical intensity. His world was one of controlled chaos, managing the arrival of 32 aircraft, each low on fuel and carrying the physical and mental exhaustion of a high-stakes combat mission. The deck was clear and fouled, meaning the wires were set, the crash crane was ready, and the medical teams were standing by in the catwalks. For the pilots of the FA-18 Super Hornets, the night trap was the most demanding 3 minutes of the entire mission. Coming in at 150 miles per hour, they had to aim for a landing area that was pitching up and down in a 3-meter swell. The pilot of the lead jet, Viper, centered the meatball, the orange light of the improved Fresnel lens optical landing system, and adjusted his throttles with millimetric precision. The cockpit was a symphony of warnings and status lights, but his focus was narrowed down to a single point on the deck. At 40 feet above the ramp, the bolter fear hit the possibility of missing the wires and having to go around for another attempt with a dwindling fuel supply. The tailhook of the Super Hornet struck the steel deck with a shower of sparks that momentarily illuminated the darkness. It snagged the 3-wire, the ideal target, and the 70,000-pound aircraft was jerked from 150 miles per hour to a dead stop in less than 250 feet. The deceleration was violent, a physical hammer blow that slammed the pilot's head against the rest and strained the nylon webbing of his shoulder harness. The engines roared as he pushed the throttles to full power, a standard safety procedure in case the wire snapped before the yellow shirt director signaled him to throttle back and taxi out of the landing area. One by one, the aircraft returned, the rhythmic thump screech of the landings echoing across the water. The deck crew moved with frantic, silent efficiency, chaining the jets to the deck and guiding them toward their parking spots on the finger and the fantail. The smell of burnt rubber from the tires and the searing heat of the brake assemblies filled the air, mixing with the cold dampness of the pre-dawn mist. By 5 in the morning, the last aircraft, the damaged Super Hornet from the VFA-86 Sidewinders, touched down safely. Its horizontal stabilizer showed a jagged, 3-foot tear where a piece of the Iranian mountain had punched through the composite skin, but the pilot taxied the jet into the hangar bay with professional composure. As the pilots climbed down their boarding ladders, they were met by the intelligence officers and the maintenance chiefs. The transition from the high-G environment of the cockpit to the solid steel of the deck was jarring. Their legs felt heavy, and their hands shook slightly from the adrenaline withdrawal. They were ushered into the CVIC, the Carrier Intelligence Center, for the initial debrief. On the large screens, the gun camera footage from the strike was already being played back in slow motion. The images were grainy but undeniable. The ventilation shafts of the Tabas 3 complex erupting in white fire, the secondary explosions of the Sejil 2 missiles, and the final, catastrophic collapse of the mountain face. The initial battle damage assessment was staggering. Satellite imagery confirmed that the primary and secondary storage bays had been completely neutralized. The Iranian long-range missile threat in the sector had been reduced to 0 in a single 60-minute window. The cost to the United States Navy was 1 damaged aircraft and 0 personnel casualties. However, the mood in the debriefing room was not one of celebration, but of somber, professional calculation. They had struck a major blow, but they were all aware that the Hornets' nest had been poked. The Iranian retaliation was no longer a question of if, but when and where. 6 in the morning. The Carrier Intelligence Center was bathed in the cold, flickering blue light of high-resolution imagery, transmitted from a Keyhole 11 reconnaissance satellite passing over the Iranian coast. The first light photos provided a clinical and undeniable confirmation of the night's work. Where the Tabbas 3 missile complex had once stood as a symbol of regional defiance, there was now only a jagged, scorched scar. On the side of the Zagros Mountains, the primary entrance tunnels had been completely erased, buried under 10,000 tons of pulverized limestone. Dark, oily plumes of smoke still drifted from the blackened vents, rising 5,000 feet into the clear morning air like a funeral shroud for the facility. The final battle damage assessment, or BDA, was read aloud to the strike group commander in a voice devoid of emotion. The destruction of Zone Alpha was confirmed at 100%. All 12 Sigil 2 medium-range ballistic missiles, each worth approximately $15 million, were categorized as total losses. The fuel storage annex in Zone Bravo had been vaporized, leaving a crater 60 meters wide and 10 meters deep. Most importantly, the command and control infrastructure in Zone Charlie had been severed from the national grid, leaving the remaining Iranian forces in the sector without a centralized brain. The strategic impact of Operation Night Saber reverberated far beyond the smoking ruins of the mountain. In a single 60-minute window, the United States Navy had neutralized the most significant long-range threat to the Strait of Hormuz. The Iranian anti-access and area denial strategy, which relied heavily on the threat of saturation missile strikes, had been fundamentally compromised. Intelligence reports from the National Security Agency indicated that the Iranian leadership was in a state of high-level internal friction, with the military commanders struggling to explain how a carrier-based strike package had penetrated their most sophisticated air defenses with such devastating precision. The cost of the engagement was analyzed with the same professional honesty. For the United States, the operation was a tactical masterpiece. One FA-18 fighter suffered moderate structural damage from debris, requiring 48 hours of maintenance in the hangar bay. No American personnel were killed or wounded. On the Iranian side, the numbers were severe. Initial estimates placed the enemy casualties at approximately 215 personnel, including 85 high-level missile technicians and several senior officers from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. While the loss of life was heavy, the Pentagon maintained that the strike was a necessary, proportional response to prevent a much larger and more catastrophic conflict. On the flight deck of the USS Abraham Lincoln, the morning sun began to bleed over the horizon, turning the gray water of the Arabian Sea into a sheet of hammered gold. The Night Saber pilots were finally asleep in their bunks, their flight suits hanging in the lockers, still smelling of sweat and recycled oxygen. In the mess decks, the sailors who had worked through the night sat over metal trays of eggs and black coffee, their faces lined with exhaustion, but their movements still sharp with the discipline of the United States Navy. The carrier was already moving to a new station, her 4 massive propellers pushing her toward a location 500 miles to the south to avoid any immediate land-based retaliation. The geopolitical landscape of the Middle East had been shifted by the events of the last 4 hours. Allies in the region, particularly those within range of the Tabbas 3 missiles, issued quiet statements of support for the decisive action taken to preserve freedom of navigation. The Iranian government, meanwhile, issued a fiery series of public condemnations, but their actual military posture remained defensive. The destruction of their primary long-range assets had left them with fewer options for escalation, a reality that their generals were now forced to acknowledge in the cold light of day. As the Abraham Lincoln moved deeper into the open ocean, the sword of the Republic was returned to its sheath, but it remained unsheathed in the minds of the adversary. The mission had achieved its primary objective, the neutralization of a clear and present danger to global stability. The silence that now hung over the Strait of Hormuz was not the silence of peace, but the quiet, watchful vigilance of a superpower that had demonstrated, once again, the lethal reach of its carrier air wings. The horizon remained clear for now, but the crew of the Lincoln knew that in this part of the world, the next storm was never more than a few degrees away.